I wanted to write from when I was a little boy, from about the age of 4. I actually wanted to write before I could even write words, before I even had any capacity to write. And I used to make little books in which I did these sort of pictures of words and sentences. And somehow I was imbued with this magic of words and this desire to join with the world of books. We were descendants of Irish people who were still had much of the Irish mentality about them. They were all sent out as convict people to be part of this. Tasmania then was the gulag of the British Empire, and all sorts of political prisoners were sent there, along with common criminals. And it was a totalitarian slave system, and my forebears were slaves in that system. Once they escaped that, they tended to go, as we say in my country, bush. They just went out into the wilderness and lived frugally, and but lived a sort of life of freedom there. They intermarried with each other, and they never married outside of this Irish Catholic peasantry. And so a century later, what remained, amongst other things, was a veneration for the word, the written word, and writers were viewed as special beings, as having an important role above and beyond most other things. My parents weren't much interested in material things because it was a world where it was impossible to rise or prosper. So these were ambitions and aspirations beyond their imagining. But the idea of the written word was extraordinary. And yet we had very few books in our house. And my grandparents, my father's parents, were actually illiterate. And he was the only one in his family who got to go to high school. And I think he had a very strong sense of a sense, I think, that people who've lived in families that had literacy for generations don't have. That words are magical, that the written word has this alchemical power to transform. Because he saw with his parents that the lack of the written word oppressed them. It denied them the power to change their lives. He also could never get over the fact that these 26, in our language, abstract symbols could summon a universe. They could be both a mirror, but they could be a transformative mirror. And if you were just competent enough, and if you cared enough, and if you were brave enough, you could create things that transcended your world. And he said this thing to me once that stayed with me, and I actually used it many years later in one of my novels, where he said that the written word was the first beautiful thing he ever knew. And because he came out of an illiterate world, his idea of literature was sort of bardic, I guess, in that he would commit to memory poetry. And it was the poetry of a man who had been born in the early 20th century, so it was the poetry of the 19th century in great English poets, some Australian poets that era, Shakespeare and so on. But he would return to these again and again, and they nourished him. And he would dwell on particular lines and particular stanzas and go ever deeper into the meaning of them. And so all these things were very powerful in the home I grew up in, and yet I didn't realise it until after I'd read many books that I too shared this sense that words were a form of magic, and I suppose in the end that writers are the magicians. I wanted to write from when I was a little boy, from about the age of 4. I actually wanted to write before I could even write words, before I even had any capacity to write. And I used to make little books in which I did these sort of pictures of words and sentences. And somehow I was imbued with this magic of words and this desire to join with the world of books. But it was a long journey, and it wasn't until I published several books that I realised that I'd actually become that thing that I'd never dared dream, which was a writer. The little books I wrote, I used to, I lived in this little wound in this great temperate rainforest that was a little mining village, just a recent construction. And I'm one of 6 children, and I'm the 5th of the 6. And what you grew up with above all were several things. One was that you were never alone. One was that you are, whatever the answer is to the great questions, it doesn't exist within yourself. It exists within others. And my big sister was away at Teachers College in a distant town in Tasmania called Launceston, which loomed in my imagination like Manhattan. And I used to send her these little books I wrote, and my mother would staple them and bind them with black electrical tape and post them to her. And I realised now that all I was ever trying to do was get out this message of love to my sister. And I think, in a sense, that's really all I've ever been doing ever since, just trying to smuggle out messages of love and hope. Growing up in this little mining village, and it was only, I was in my 40s in New York, wandering those great streets of that storied city. And I realised the people there, the measure of everything extraordinary is man-made. And I'd grown up in this raw violence of this little mining town. But there were many extraordinary things about it, but the measure of what was most extraordinary was everything that wasn't man-made. It was this vast ancient rainforest around it that went back. It's full of plants that go back to the time of the dinosaurs. It has some of the oldest living organisms in the world, trees 13,000 years old. It's a dynamic land that you see it move. When you wouldn't have to walk far or drive far, and you would come upon the remains of other old mining towns that had lasted 10 or 20 years, and then the rainforest had just consumed it back up. And you would see things like a huge rainforest tree that had grown through a railway dog and lifted it 20 metres into the air. So there it is, flying through what to your eyes would look like a jungle. A railway carriage from half a century ago in the middle of a rainforest. So all these things imbued me with a very different sense of the possibilities of life. And although it seemed a small place, there was a largeness to it. There was a sense of time that wasn't European linear time. And later I studied history, and then I came here to Europe to further my study of history. And although I loved it, its neatness and its the ease with which it could reach conclusions and answers came from this ability to see time, just like a railway line that stopped at all stations of human progress or regress and keep on going. But the time I grew up with, the idea of time I grew up with, which was so deeply embedded that the stories that all these people who used to crowd into our kitchen and our world would use, was a circular idea of time, in which things that happened 100 years ago had as much relevance as things happening today and would have with things happening in the future. And some years ago, I was I spend time with different Indigenous communities, which is a great honour for me, and I always learn new and extraordinary things from these times. And I was sent, I'd been up with the Yolngu in northeast Arnhem Land, and I was sent an essay a young Yolngu woman called Sienna Stubbs had written about the Yolngu, their understanding of time. So the Yolngu are a remarkable people right up the north of Australia in the tropics. And they have 4 tenses, so we have 3, past, present and future. And they have this 4th one, which is past, present and future all occurring simultaneously. And so when they say something like, we're mending the fish traps today down on the beach, they're also saying, when they use this tense, that the ancestors are building the fish traps 1,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago, and our successors will be building fish traps 1,000 years hence and 5,000 years hence. And once you start to think about this, you realise at once it struck me with this force of revelation that this was the same sense of time that I'd been brought up in. It made me think how much, for all that we propose an idea of a colonisation so complete that it destroyed this 60,000-year-old culture, it's utterly untrue that the people, the culture that arose in my country was also influenced and shaped by that 60,000-year-old culture. Something emerged in the mashup that was different than normal Western culture and had taken on a lot of these ideas. So what I learned from this sense of time, it was once something extraordinarily familiar that I realised actually went right back to this Indigenous world, that it wasn't lost, that it still lived on. It also, the more I thought about it, proposes an utterly different sense of your relationship with the world, because in the high Western idea of time, we are creatures without responsibilities because we only exist for now, as we say. There's only now. But if there's more than now, if there's then and then there's also tomorrow, then we have great responsibilities to think differently about the earth and how we treat it, to think differently about others and how we treat them, to think differently about how we are with all living things, because these things have always been and they will always continue. So I found it at once a revelation, a confirmation, an exhilaration, and I conclude the book describing a traumatic event I had as a young man when I nearly drowned. But what intrigued me about that now is that, in a sense, not in a sense, I've always known that, in fact, I'm still there drowning, and that everything that's happened ever since, including this interview here now in Denmark, is just a dream. And at some point, I will return to that place in the River Dark, and it will end. And it allowed me to write, to finally write something that had lain uneasily within myself for too long. And that's the conclusion to the book. with an epilogue about the joy of having escaped it for as long as the dream has been. Because I think I wrote the book after the COVID years, and I think everyone around the world, people became concerned with this question of how to live, and that there are no easy answers to that, but it is to recognise the rapture and joy that living allows you if you will just open up to it. The title, Question 7, comes from a Chekhov short story written at the beginning of his career when he was a spattling medical student, and he used to write comic sketches for newspapers to raise money for his studies and his family. The particular story is just really a series of absurdist riffs on those mental arithmetic questions that you're given in primary school. And he's got 12 of them. And question 7 reads something like, 18th of May 1881, a train leaves station A at 3 a.m. and is set to arrive at station B at 11 p.m. Just as it is about to leave, the order comes that it must arrive at 5 p.m. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? And it's just a joke, and it's a very sweet joke. And in those 3 sentences, you get the essence of everything Chekhov was ever to do thereafter. Because again and again, his stories propose a concrete world, a world of a surface reality we think is reality. We think that is the real texture, and it is our understanding of life, of timetables, of obligations. And then suddenly, always in a Chekhov story, there's a moment where you fall through this void, and suddenly there is these enormous questions, which are actually the forces that impel us through life, that haunt us, that terrify us, that excite us. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? Why do we love? Why do we hate? How to live? Why do we wish to live? They're the questions that consume us. What is a good life? What is a life wasted? They're the things that ultimately are the true subject of literature. And it was those questions, and I think above all the question of what it is to live, and the importance of love and kindness, that question 7 is really about. Of course, it's a book only of questions. We live in an age in which certainty is metastasised into a crisis where everybody is certain they know, and yet clearly nobody knows anything much at all. And so the book is just one of looking under the carpet again and again, of asking ever more questions. It's not the role of literature to answer things. A novel, great literature, isn't condemned to being consistent or coherent or correct or ethical. Religion, politics, ideology, all these things are certain, all these things are coherent. But a novel literature, when it succeeds, merely takes us to the edge of that void that is the chaos of life, and it reminds us of, like laughter, like music, that is the truth of us. And so that was all I was seeking to do in this book, was to ask questions, not to propose any answers. And I think my subject is not power, but those answers that people make with kindness and with love. I think that's what interests me. But really those things are subjects for other people. You know, I'm not the ornithologist on the bird flying free. As Kafka said, a cage went in search of a bird, and for a writer to try and divine themselves is a foolish and forlorn task that just leads them into folly and vanity, I think. Power in Tasmania has always been maintained by the parcelling up and giving away of its natural world. And that began in colonial times when the kangaroo hunting grounds of the Palawa were given away to the rich of England. And it's continued on to the present day with its forests, with mines, now with its waters for salmon farming. And I would rather not have to talk about these things, but it still is the society still remains one in which many people find it difficult to speak, in which power can be exercised quite brutishly. It's not to say it's still a democracy, but people will be, in the parlance of the place, driven off the island. They'll have careers destroyed. They'll have businesses finished. That they face an enormous amount of pressure to stay silent. And so your situation as a writer who is allowed a voice, who doesn't have to immediately answer to power in that island, you're faced with a terrible choice to join in a silence that represses your world, or to seek to break it. And so, you know, on occasion I do speak out but I fundamentally don't see that as different than anything I do in my novels. It's simply pointing and naming to what the truth is. I don't ultimately see it as a political act. It's just saying that is there. Look at it, and please don't pretend that is right or good. Please don't lie to us.